Now it's time for today's perspective, and it was right back in 1899 that the former mayor of Jerusalem, alarmed by the first calls to create a Jewish national home, spoke out, saying that the indigenous people that lived there would not easily accept their own displacement. Well, now, more than a century and a quarter later, his great-great-nephew sweeps through the years that have passed to analyse, really, over 100 years of the war waged against the Palestinians. My guest on the programme today is that great-great-nephew, who is one of the world's leaders on analysing the Middle East conflict throughout the decades, 8-book historian and Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. Rashid Khalidi is here in Paris for several appearances, including at the Institut du Monde Arabe later this evening, and he joins me now here on set. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme.
Pleasure to be here.
As I said, you published a whole series of books on the Middle East, the ongoing conflict there. But you talk about how long the conflict there has been going on. And as I said at the top there, how it was, your former relative, former mayor of Jerusalem, who recognised those problems right at the beginning so long ago.
That's correct. He was someone who'd lived in Vienna. He understood anti-Semitism. And he said, the Jews are our cousins. And Zionism is understandable, given the persecution you're subject to. But for the sake of God, don't do this in Palestine. As you mentioned at the top, he said, there is a people here already, and they will not easily accept being replaced.
And
so
obviously
he was
what
warning.
he said was completely proven to be correct.
I mean, it's an 8-page letter written in French, and it's extraordinarily prescient. I mean, the man was telling the world this is what might, or telling Herzl personally what might happen.
And from that, I mean, one of your most prominent books, 100 Years War on Palestine, has just been translated into French, in fact, for the first time. It takes readers, doesn't it, through the whole 100 years or so, uses a whole series of archive material. We've got some of the images that we're going to show during the interview. Where did that archive material come from? Some of it came even from your own family, didn't it?
It started with a library that my grandfather established in Jerusalem. It was the first public library in Jerusalem. And he did it actually in the same year that my great-great-uncle sent a letter to Herzl, 1899. My great-grandmother gave him a bequest, and he founded the library. And I was working in that library for a previous book, and I found not only materials that had to do with what I was writing about, but the materials having to do with my great-great-uncle. And so I used that library and other family libraries in Jerusalem for an earlier book and for this book to show from the perspective of individual Palestinians, people mainly in my own family, how they lived through these episodes that I argue are the most important ones in this 100 years war on Palestine.
And how did that make it? I mean, presumably that made it a lot more personal for you, being able to use those real family traits to tell the story.
I mean, I had been trained as a historian at Oxford not to be part of the story. I had been trained not to use the first person. I'd been trained to write in a certain way. And I had to disabuse myself of all my training. My son and other relatives said to me, enough already with writing these boring history books for boring professors and students. Write something based on your own experience, on the family stories that we're told, that can make this relatable to the ordinary reader. Yeah. And so that's what I tried to do in this book.
That's an incredible way of going about it and doing it. Throughout the book and throughout all your other books as well, you look at some of those key moments, don't you? For example, fall of the Ottoman Empire, 1918. I mean, how difficult is it to research moments like that, and why were moments like that so important, do you think?
Well, I had, fortunately, memoirs of people who were involved. One of my uncles, actually 4 of my uncles, served as officers in the Ottoman army. And one of them wrote a 3-volume memoir. And so I used that to describe that and other materials by other members of my family to describe the horrors they went through, seeing the bodies lying in the streets of Beirut from famine, or refugees from the Armenian genocide coming through Palestine or Lebanon. And so I was fortunate, because my family has been involved at different levels at different times in these events, to have a rich archive to draw on.
And there are other major moments as well that you talk about particularly. One of the key moments, of course, the creation of the State of Israel, and 1967, the Six-Day War, saw Israel take Gaza and Sinai. The academic and activist Edward Said, he's the man your own Professor Emeritus thesis is based on, describing those as key moments when the Palestinian people really became much more visible to the whole world.
Right. I talked about these things on the basis of documents. So I use American diplomatic documents to talk about how the United States gave a green light to Israel in 1967. But at the same time, I talk about my own personal experiences. My father worked at the UN in the Security Council, and I described the meeting of the Security Council, and I used the transcripts of the meeting, but I also used what my father told me had actually happened. So I tried in that case, in the case of other key moments, the 1982 war, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, I was living in Beirut. And so I described not only the documents that I found in my research about the PLO, about the French government's involvement and so on, I described what I saw and what I felt when the bombing started, when I had to pick up my kids from school, those kinds of things.
And having done all this research and spoken to so many people, I mean, how can you characterize, how can you put into words what that has meant for the Palestinian people? I mean, here in the West, I've been lucky enough during my life not to experience war on my doorstep.
Right.
People who live in other parts of the world have faced it continuously, haven't they?
Correct.
I mean, how on earth is it possible to live in that kind of situation?
I mean, we lived in Beirut for many years of war, 10 years of war, my wife and I. We had 3 children there. And I describe in the chapter about the 82 war what it was like. I mean, dealing with burning garbage in the streets, reassuring children when there's bombing going on, those kinds of things. People survive, but it takes a toll. And I try and describe that as well as the diplomatic maneuverings and so on, which I document. I mean, there's 45 pages of footnotes which talk about that part of it. And there are many, many, many sections which are just my father told me or my aunt described to me or whatever. Or this memoir of this uncle tells us this. So, I mean, part of this story is not told in the West. In the West, we have a very rich Israeli narrative, which pretty much dominates in the media, political discourse. To a lesser extent now in the academy. Universities now are free of that. There's a range of views. You can find out what I think are the realities. And I'm not only trying to do that in this book. I'm trying to make this relatable through experiences of ordinary people. I mean, we were not an ordinary family. We were a well-to-do family. It was a family that was involved in politics. But at the same time, we went through, my grandfather was displaced from his home in Jaffa. I described that. So I tried to put both of those elements into this book.
Is it changing at all, do you think, that narrative that we hear here in the West so much?
Entirely. I mean, we have had in Gaza what every legal expert who's pronounced on this has called a genocide. And the media, frankly, to be very frank, especially in the United States, but I think everywhere, has been complicit in not showing the true reality. Now, the Israelis have played a role in that by not letting any foreign journalists into Gaza. They clearly have a great deal to hide. But journalists in Gaza, in many cases at the risk of their lives, have chronicled this. And it's appeared on social media, and it's even broken to some extent into the mainstream media. And I think that has caused a sea change. I mean, American public opinion has shifted by tens of percentage points over the past 2.5, 3 years. And that's been caused by what happened in Gaza. And I think in a broader sense, by the fact that people realize we've been conned. We've been told a story which is not fully true, or in some cases completely false. And they're beginning to see that there's a different narrative there. So you can go to the United States anyway. I don't think this is true everywhere, but certainly true in the States, and find literally dozens of books that would never have been published.
And do you think that sea change in the US and here in Europe as well could influence in future what happens in the Middle East?
It will when the cultural and political elites get off their high horse and listen to the people. I mean, public opinion in the United States has changed. Political discourse in the United States has not really fully changed. It has the Democratic Party and some segments of society, some elements of the elites. For example, publishing. You can publish almost anything today in the United States. Major publishers will do that. But you can't stage a play on Palestine. You cannot get distribution for a film that wins an Oscar if it has to do with Palestine. And France is, in my limited experience, at least as bad, if not worse. So public opinion has changed everywhere, but it has to percolate up and force the people at the top to change policies.
You're critical of the Palestinians as well, aren't you? Notably, Palestinian leaders, when you feel, or it's been proved to show that they, in the past, have taken the wrong turn.
I was very critical of the leadership in the 20s and the 30s, perhaps overly critical. And I was extremely critical of the PLO and other Palestinian leaderships in the last few decades. I was involved in politics. I lived in Beirut. I mean, I was teaching at the American University, but I was also involved in what was happening. And so I saw from the inside both the decisions they made that I thought were right and the decisions they made that I know are wrong or were wrong. The Oslo Accords, for example. I was a negotiator at the Madrid and Washington peace negotiations between a Palestinian delegation and an Israeli delegation. I was an advisor. So I saw all of that from the inside. And then I saw what the PLO did later on at Oslo that I had nothing to do with. And I can tell you for a fact that they made terrible, terrible, terrible mistakes. And those aren't the only ones.
We're running out of time, but I've got 30 seconds to ask you. I mean, looking at what's happening now, I mean, is there any sign of optimism is what I suppose I want to ask.
I mean, one of the things that gives me hope is that the Palestinians have not given up. I mean, I was in Palestine in December. There's a population of millions of people who are not going to leave. And that means that somehow there's a basis for those two peoples figuring something out. And it's not clear how that will happen. The second thing is Israel is totally dependent on you Europeans and we Americans. Totally dependent. Every warplane, every 2,000-pound bomb, every Security Council veto. I could go on. And with public opinion changing as rapidly as it has and as dramatically as it has, sooner or later that's going to have an effect. Israel will not have the freedom of action to do the kinds of things that they are doing and have been doing in Gaza and are doing now in Lebanon and did with the United States and Iran, when public opinion finally can force the politicians to do the right thing.
Great to have you with us on the programme today. Thank you very much for coming in and talking to us. Rashid Khalidi there, who is 8-book historian, as I said, and Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He's appearing tonight, if you like, at the Institute of Monde Arabe. Thanks very much.
Thank you.